things first. We remember when we talked yesterday with that Sino-Soviet Treaty of Alliance in 1950, that the Soviet Union would send some technical advisors into China to help them develop their military and technology capabilities. Well, after the Cold War, after the advent of the Cold War, after 1949, when the Soviets have nuclear weapons, obviously, what do you think is a crucial technology that China wants to get its hands on? An atomic bomb, a nuclear weapon. Well, as the Sino-Soviet Split begins to be created, and time out for one moment, I don't know that there is a date of the Sino-Soviet Split. It's not like one day the Soviet Union called China and said, hey, we need to talk. All right? I think you know this. I know this. We're just not what we used to be. All right? And I don't know. I think it's time for us both to move on. No, it's not completely you. I know. No. But you know what? It's just not working. All right? That never happened, okay? The Sino-Soviet Split is like more organic. It's like issue after issue after issue, pulling these two entities further apart to the point where they essentially have no relationship anymore. In 1960, the Soviet Union would pull out all of their technical and military advisors from China. So right about here is where we could say is a pretty good place to say if we must have a date for the Sino-Soviet Split, let's think 1960 going forward. But obviously a lot of issues came before that, right? There were a lot of other straws put on the camel's back before we get to that point. In 1963, you guys might remember a brief mention, but we'll talk about it more later. In 1963, in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Nikita Khrushchev and President Kennedy will sign what's called the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which is going to, shockingly, ban atmospheric nuclear testing. Yes? Oh my gosh. It's going to ban atmospheric nuclear testing. Now, of course, what's a guy like Mao going to think of a ban like this, an agreement like this? Khrushchev is weak. You should be using these nuclear weapons, and you should be certainly not backing down. Yes, sir. Thank you.
All the freshmen are getting them.
Beautiful. Thank you. So again, Mao calls them weak, just like Mao had done with the Cuban Missile Crisis, saying that those nuclear weapons in Cuba should have been used against the Americans. Kevin.
Is the test only banning atmospheric?
Yes, this is atmospheric testing.
But I mean, does it ban anything underground or
Nope.
underwater?
Nope. Testing can continue, but atmospheric testing is done. So like our original testing, and when you see the big like mushroom cloud in the horizon, that stuff is done. We still do a lot of underground testing and whatnot. I don't know that environmental reasons were the biggest cause. Maybe. I think there's more of a atmospheric testing, like of these massive nuclear weapons. Like the Soviet Union had just before this detonated that Tsar Bomba, this like 60 megaton bomb whose shockwave went around the planet 3 times. I think that when it's like in the open and recorded for everybody to see is such a visual representation of the threat of nuclear war that we wanted to end that because these tests just ratchet up the tension. Anyhow, the Soviets are going to leave China. Soviet scientists leave China in 1960. But China is continuing its own research on developing an atomic bomb. And in 1964, they develop their own atomic bomb. So the Chinese become a nuclear power in the mid-1960s. In 67, they develop a hydrogen bomb. I don't think you guys need to memorize these dates at all. In 1967, they develop a hydrogen bomb. And by 1970, the Chinese put their first satellite into space. But we remember in the story of the arms race, what do satellites mean? You have a missile, a rocket, capable of getting it into orbit, which means you can just change the trajectory of that a little bit, and you now have a long-range ballistic missile. All right? So now China is a nuclear power. In 1968, the Soviet Union will get a new leader, a guy named Leonid Brezhnev. And now here's a good time to share with you one of the oddest gifts my mother-in-law ever gave me. These are oh, I'm sorry, pardon me. These are my Soviet leader or Russian leader nesting dolls. Russian nesting dolls, perfectly fitting. What are they called? Matryoshka. Did I say that right? I'm sure I didn't. Anyway, on the outside, who's this guy? You guys might not know him. This is Boris Yeltsin. We'll let the camera see Boris Yeltsin, too. There you go. Whoa. Here's Boris Yeltsin. He's the guy that's going to be leading Russia in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union. So we're going to put Boris Yeltsin over here. And then this guy. Very good, Mikhail Gorbachev. We can see his birthmark on his forehead. So that's how we notice Mikhail Gorbachev. Pop him out of there. Now, there's two guys in the early 80s, a guy named Chernyenko and another guy named Andropov, who also lead the Soviet Union in the very early 80s. But they were already very old, and they were relatively insignificant in this whole story, so they don't get dolls. Then we have Leonid Brezhnev. Oh, there he is. Leonid Brezhnev. We're going to notice him. If you ever see a political cartoon and it has something to do with the Cold War, and you see a guy with very pronounced eyebrows, that is Leonid Brezhnev. You see him. Look at those eyebrows, right? Don't trust a guy with very pronounced eyebrows. Yeah, or Joey. Yeah, anyway, then my dolls get interesting. As I pop this out of here, who we got here? Oh, he's falling apart. Who's that? That's Joseph Stalin. Yeah, I know. Where's Khrushchev? Now I'm not missing anything, and Sarika can assert that there's no room for Khrushchev. If I were to fit a Khrushchev in here, that would be like tighter than Khrushchev fitting into the swimming trunk, right? So there's no room for Khrushchev in here. So why no Khrushchev? Why no Khrushchev between Stalin and Brezhnev? I don't really know the answer to that. Yeah, what do you think, Kev?
Because Stalin and Brezhnev are more similar. Brezhnev being produced with all the personality.
Yeah, maybe we've got some more similarities, or maybe it has something to do with going along those lines. After Khrushchev, a lot of hardliners, and like after the Cuban Missile Crisis, a lot of hardliners in the Soviet Union weren't too fond of Nikita Khrushchev anymore. Thought he was actually weak in the face of the Americans as well. That's why Khrushchev is going to be moved out of power. And eventually Brezhnev will rise. And then inside, we got a tiny little Lenin that finishes everything up. Cute, right? So anyway, interesting gift from my mother-in-law a few years back. Amazingly, after teaching it for so many years, I still have them, and they haven't broken or been stolen. So, yay. Go UAS. So Leonid Brezhnev comes to power in 1982. Pardon me, 1968, and he's going to rule until 1982, or lead the Soviet Union until 1982. Brezhnev coming to power brings another cooling of tensions. Like things get worse between the Soviet Union and China. When Brezhnev comes to power, yes, sir. Yeah, I'm confused on whether they're getting colder, they're icy, they're getting worse. Yes. I don't know. We use these warm remember the thaw in the 1950s? That was actually a good thing. Things got better, but then things got icier again. I don't know. It's confusing. Things got worse when Brezhnev came to power. Brezhnev issued what became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, and the Brezhnev Doctrine is akin to the United States Truman Doctrine, where we said that we would support any nation that was fighting against threats from outside or within. In particular, we were focused on Greece and Turkey. The Brezhnev Doctrine essentially pledges Soviet support for any country whose communist government is being threatened. All right? And so Brezhnev is going to use this Brezhnev Doctrine first, for example, in the country of Czechoslovakia in 1968. We'll talk about this more on a later date. Later, they go into Afghanistan. They invade Afghanistan. We'll talk about that at a later date. Well, Mao starts to feel that Brezhnev is a force to be reckoned with. That Brezhnev is a much stronger figure than Khrushchev ever was. So Mao is very nervous about Leonid Brezhnev. And maybe he was right to be nervous, because in the next year, in 1969, the Soviet Union and China will actually fight a small war against each other known as the Sino-Soviet Border War, because it was a war between China and the Soviet Union along their shared border. Now, this was not a big war, but there were concerns that this could escalate into a nuclear conflict. It didn't, but those concerns were there. The point of this is to just make sure we have that understanding that the relationship between China and the Soviet Union was worse than the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union had ever been. All right? They actually go to a small war with each other. This would be the lowest point in Sino-Soviet relations. To add more of a mess to the story, we've got the situation in Vietnam. Now, you guys probably remember that during the Vietnam War, the North Vietnamese were being supplied from outside by China and the Soviet Union. In the aftermath of the Vietnam War, the Soviet Union became Vietnam's primary benefactor. The Soviet Union was Vietnam's chief ally, not China. Anyone want to take a stab as to why Vietnam might feel more comfortable being allied with China or Soviet Union rather than China?
They were previously conquered by China.
Yeah, you got a couple thousand years of animosity between those countries and territory being invaded and such. So the Soviet Union and Vietnam are in cahoots with each other, which causes China to look to support Cambodia next door to Vietnam. Now, if you recall, when we discussed the end of the Vietnam War, we said that the domino theory started and Cambodia and Laos ended up becoming communist, right? But Cambodia's communism is going to be different from Vietnamese communism. Cambodia is going to be taken over by a regime called the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge. And they're going to be led by a guy named Pol Pot. Pol Pot is one of those guys that can stand along Mao and Stalin and Hitler of truly bad dudes during the 20th century. Pol Pot. Some estimates say that under Pol Pot's regime within Cambodia, maybe a third of the population was killed in this communist takeover, focusing on anybody that was, for example, an intellectual, or anybody that was a part of the old regime. Vietnam looked across the border into Cambodia and thought that this was such a dangerous government and it was actually threatening the Vietnamese government's existence, and there were some border skirmishes there, that the nation of Vietnam, in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, will actually invade Cambodia. In response to this, China, who's supporting Cambodia, is going to invade Vietnam in 1979. So in 1979, China invades the nation of Vietnam. So now we have China supporting Cambodia, invading Vietnam, who is supported by the Soviet Union. What a mess, right? But what are we absolutely sure of now about NSC 68 and the notion that all communism is one monolithic entity directed from Moscow? Yeah. Yeah, there can be no reality in that. Yes?
So, does the U.S. actually recognize this and make changes to the policy?
Yeah. The Nixon Doctrine is a big sign of that we start to recognize that we can't worry about every little action around the world. Absolutely. And we will talk more about that at a later date as well. All right. This continues some of the lowest points in this Sino-Soviet relationship. But this also causes China to look really bad. Because Cambodia and Pol Pot looked really bad on the global scene because of their actions in their own country. And now China is backing up that. So China looks really bad here. Things will only change when a new leader comes to power in China, and that leader is a guy whose name we've already heard. That is Deng Xiaoping. You can see it written up here. Deng Xiaoping goes way back. Remember in 1957, he was the guy that said that the Soviets should be, or the Chinese should be the leaders of international communism. Well, now in 1982, he becomes the leader of, in the late 70s, he becomes the leader of China. Deng Xiaoping is the reason that China today is what China today is. That China reformed economically and allowed outside investment, particularly in Western investment, into China, turning China from a massively populated but horribly, horribly poor nation to today a massively populated and in many respects very rich nation. Not on a per capita basis still, but national wealth. And that comes from Deng Xiaoping. This is going to usher in an era between the Soviets and the Chinese known as rapprochement. R-A-P-P-R-O-C-H-E-M-E-N-T. I guess I can do that. That's even easier. It's a French word to mean reapproach, to come together again. So after this era of the Sino-Soviet Split, now the Soviet Union and China will come together again. Mao dies, we get the rise of Deng Xiaoping. Leonid Brezhnev himself will die in 1982. And soon after, we get a new Soviet leader, a guy named Mikhail Gorbachev. That's going to be in 1985. So by the time we have Mikhail Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping, both the Soviet Union and China are willing to offer some reforms within their nations, as well as easing their tense relationship between them. Gorbachev made it as one of his goals to ease the tension with the Soviet Union, to improve relationships with China. China and the Soviet Union will enter into new trade and cultural agreements. Mikhail Gorbachev will usher in some reforms in the Soviet Union. We're going to talk much more about these on a later date, called glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost refers to political openness, being more open, allowing more free press in the Soviet Union. And perestroika deals with an economic restructuring and a political restructuring, allowing some free elections in local communities, for example, or allowing more free enterprise on a local level. These are big-time reforms for the Soviet Union. And many will support the idea that Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms will ultimately lead to the end of the Soviet Union. You know the classic tale, if you give a mouse a cookie, he's probably going to want a glass of milk. And if you give him a glass of milk, he's going to need a napkin, and then he wants to go see a movie or something. I don't know, it goes on and on. Well, if you give a Soviet citizen the right to vote in a local election, they might eventually want more say on wider elections. If you give them the right to have some free enterprise, they might want more. Or if you give them those rights, maybe Eastern Europe would demand the same things as well. We'll talk about that more at a later date. But guess what? Mikhail Gorbachev starts reforming the Soviet Union. What do you think Chinese people are going to want? The exact same thing. In 1989, Mikhail Gorbachev has a planned visit to Beijing. And as Mikhail Gorbachev is going to be making his way to Beijing, crowds of students begin to thrust themselves upon Beijing, the capital city, what is known as Tiananmen Square. Yes, 1989. Tiananmen Square. T-I-A-N, whatever, I'll do it up here again. T-I-A-N-A-N, Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square. While the government in China was open to some aspects of economic reform, they certainly weren't willing to have any political reform. And the government declared martial law. Martial law is when you basically send in the military to serve as a police force. The government declared martial law and ordered these student protesters to go home. Violence ensued. Maybe up to 2,000 to 3,000 people were killed. The world really doesn't know the extent of it. It was condemned by the wider world. But for our story, what's important is that Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union ushered in political and economic reforms that ultimately led to the end of the Soviet Union. China, under Deng Xiaoping, said, we will have some economic reforms in our state, but we will not give up any of our political control. So in 1991, the Soviet Union collapses and it ceases to exist. In 2016, the Communist Party of China still holds an iron grip over the nation of China. There is no free and democratic aspects to Chinese society. All right? But today, they have the most powerful, or largest, I should say, economy in the world. So if you're the Chinese Communist Party, guess what they can think? We were right. We were doing it right all along. All right? Questions, comments, concerns?